Hello, and welcome to today's webinar on developing your child's middle school IEP with Amy McDougall, a school psychologist and mom to a teen with PWS. During this live webinar, Amy will discuss the mandated elements of an individual education plan and outline guiding questions to ensure that your child's individual needs, particularly those related to PWS, are addressed as you work in collaboration with your district to develop your child's middle school IEP. Before we begin, a few notes about participation. My name is Andrea Lucy, and I'm the Membership and Chapter Coordinator at PWSA USA. Your audio was muted when you joined the call. Questions can be submitted via the question box on your screen. We should have ample time for questions after the presentation. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel. It is now my pleasure to welcome our presenter today. Hi, Amy. Thanks for being here with us.
Thanks so much for the opportunity. So really a couple of things just to talk about tonight. Obviously, there's a lot of things about Prader-Willi that are kind of there all along, but each new grade level brings some new challenges with it. Andrea, I do not seem to be moving with the mouse or my arrows.
Sure, let's try it again, see if that works for you.
I clicked on it and there we go. All right. So really like to cover a couple of different things this evening. Real briefly, plan to touch on an overview of some of those relevant terms, just to kind of give a little baseline for talking about IEPs. Talk about what really should be in an IEP, and then talk about what should be in an IEP from a very PWS specific perspective. There are different sections of the IEP that we're going to want to touch on, and part of this is really going to include being prepared from discussions about behavior and discipline, and eventually looking at transitioning to adult life. All right. I am not up. There we go. I seem to need to hit it a couple of times before it moves. So when I say know the lingo, it's kind of a running joke around my house because my husband teases me about psychobabble, but frequently we often get just caught up in using those acronyms. So a couple of things that you might hear tossed around on occasion. RTI and MTSS are really kind of the same thing. The idea of response to intervention or having a multi-tiered system of support really focuses on the idea that you don't jump just from general education to special education, that you're always looking at providing additional interventions to see if a student would respond, and then moving forward with additional supports if they're not making growth with what you're giving them. Oftentimes we're not specifically talking about that with Prader-Willi, especially at this age, because you've already moved past that and our kids are usually identified at this point. Obviously, CSE, Committee on Special Education, LRE for least restrictive environment. And the idea there is that we really want to see our kids in with their typical peers as much as possible. That being said, what we really need to do is look at our individual kids' needs to talk about what's the most least restrictive setting for them, because for some kids that might mean pretty much just being in a general education setting with a little bit of special education support, whereas other kids are going to need a more special class setting. As we go through the IEP, you're going to hear me start to lapse into talking about PLEPs or present levels. And that's really talking about where are our kids at right now? How are they functioning? FAPE is free and appropriate public education, and I think that the really key word to pay attention to there is appropriate. A lot of times we start thinking about, really hitting a gold standard and what our kids absolutely need, when the difference is that the guidelines and the regulations from the federal government really talk about what's appropriate. So they're not looking at necessarily maximizing, but giving kids what they need to do to be successful. PWN, prior written notice, really focuses in on whenever there's going to be a change or a meeting or you're signing consent, you should always have been informed about that in advance in writing, so that you have a chance to look at things and really be informed. Kind of like in a doctor's office, they talk about informed consent. Prior written notice, that's really the intent there, is to have that informed consent from an educational perspective. Functional behavioral assessments and behavior intervention plans and manifestation determinations, I'm going to kind of skim past right now because we're going to talk about those in a little bit more detail later on. So one of the questions that I often hear really focuses in on what would make more sense for my child to have, an IEP or a 504 plan. Sometimes you hear people ask if they should even have both. The reality is that the 504 plan, they're very different from an IEP because those are more focused on civil rights. So it's more about access. A lot of that law is about making sure that like individuals, could get into environments, that they could function in a classroom. It's not so much about services, it's just about accessing them. So what they'll talk about is having a physical or a mental impairment that impacts a major life activity, but it's not focused in on that free and appropriate public education to make sure that they have a plan in place to meet our individuals' unique needs. IEP comes out of education law. And so as such, what you'll find is there's a lot more regulations. There's a lot more, really the best way I can think to describe it is there's a lot more teeth to it when it comes down to ensuring that our kids' needs are met in a school setting. In a lot of things that could go on a 504 are really just about modifications, where an IEP is really going to focus in on services. So what I typically tell people is that there's nothing that could really go on a 504 that shouldn't be included in IEP. So I always encourage parents of children with Prader-Willi to absolutely pursue an IEP. Anything that they might want to have in terms of a modification on a 504 should absolutely be included in their IEP. And that's where they should really look at, because that's going to allow them to have a lot more legal standing when something might not go well. So in terms of that IEP, there's a lot of things that really have to be in the IEP. But what it really does, it's a written statement that outlines all the different things that need to be provided to meet that individual student's unique educational needs. What we're going to talk about tonight are present levels, or that current performance. So you look at academics, social and physical, and management, in all the ways that our children are impacted in those different areas. Those will really be the basis for the rest of the IEP. We'll talk about consideration of special factors. There's some information there about behavior that might impede learning and whether or not some additional supports are needed. And what'll happen is that those present levels should drive goals. So really, if there's an area of need in terms of any of those present levels, that should be what you're using to define what a goal should be. I would really encourage, as we're talking about that, to make sure that it's based on what our children's current functioning is, not what everybody else in the classroom should be doing. And then obviously the needs that are outlined in the present levels are going to start defining all the other things, such as, special education services, related services, modifications, and supports. So we'll talk through those in a little bit more, but those are all things that are mandated to be part of an IEP. So, but before we get talking about what should be in the IEP, I want you to take a moment to think about a couple of things, because your answers to these questions are really going to help prepare you to be able to have conversations about your child's needs. So before you go into a meeting or before you think about writing an IEP, I'd encourage you to step back and think about what are your concerns and your biggest worries for your child. Where are the areas that you feel like they're really lacking skills? They might not be safe. Where are those impacts going to be, and what do you want to see happen for them? The next step would be, what do you want your child to be do in the short term? Because the reality is an IEP is really, it's a time limited document. It's for the next year. So if you're setting some really, really lofty goals that your child's not going to be able to achieve in the next year, it's hard to write a really good solid IEP. So you need to think about, what do you want to see happen in the next year? What would be like that step that makes you feel like you're moving forward? This is a really big one. Do I believe that hyperphagia is a behavior that can be trained away or a symptom of a physical drive? And your stance on this is really going to impact how you interact with the school staff and how they in turn are probably going to relate to your child. If you're looking at hyperphagia as something that, is just a behavior that, you expect that they're going to be able to just stop it or you can train it away, you're opening up the possibility that there's going to be punishment for not following through on that. There are going to be consequences. They're going to be pushing kids to do things that they just might not be able to reasonably achieve. Whereas if you're looking at the hyperphagia as a symptom of physical drive, you're talking about something that needs to be accommodated for, that needs to be, interventions need to be planned for the environment to structure it. So what you're really looking at when you differentiate based on this question is, do I believe that my child should be responsible for no longer food seeking? Or do I believe that the school should be providing all the structures and supports to ensure that they're safe, and that their food seeking isn't going to be a part of impacting their education? And this is a big one because I think you're going to hear me talk a lot about the fact that I definitely feel strongly that the hyperphagia is a symptom of a physical drive. If you build that stance that they're just going to be able to stop doing it, I really feel like you're setting kids up for failure because they're going to be expected to do something that they necessarily can't learn to do. And that's a very frustrating place to be, both for the child and for the school. And lastly, as we start going into this middle school level, it's really important to take a step back and think about your expectations for your child after they leave their high school experience. If you're looking for your child to be fully independent, that's going to really push you to go in one direction in terms of your goals and what you're seeking for them. Or if you believe that they're probably always going to need some level of support, then that kind of frees you up to make sure that a lot of those things are in place as you go through the high school experience. I think one of the biggest disservices that we can do to our kids is when we fully recognize that when they're in school, they need high levels of support. They need one-to-one aides. They need adults looking out for them. And they spend their entire educational experience with that level of support. But then the minute they walk out the door of the school, they're expected to just function independently. That really does our kids a disservice, in that they're not training for their life after school. But I think that it's also really important to recognize that if you go back and acknowledge that that hyperphagia is more a symptom of the physical drive, that you're probably always looking at that level of support in some way as you go forward. So a lot of your goals that you're setting are going to be for supported independence versus full independence. And then as you really start thinking about it all, how do you really roll all of that into describing your child's needs in a way that's relevant to classroom instruction? Because that's going to be the emphasis for the school regardless. They're going to be thinking about educational impact. Certainly we have some big long-range thoughts on our mind for our kids with Prader-Willi, but the reality is that the school is going to be thinking about academics, and they're going to be thinking about helping your child develop into a functioning adult. And so you're going to want to help, guide that conversation as you go through these discussions. So a couple of different things. When you start looking at our present levels of functioning, the first one focuses in on academic achievement and learning. Obviously, you're going to talk about reading, writing, and math. But then there's a few things that really kind of impact a student's ability to fully engage in the classroom learning environment. So you start thinking about speech and language skills. Are they going to understand what's being said to them? Are they going to need repetition? Are they going to need to make sure that things are explained a little bit more? And then those functional skills for learning, like attention, ability to participate in adult-directed tasks, ability to remain engaged. Because the reality is that skills like that, those more functional soft skills, if they don't have those in place, reading and writing and math is going to be really tough. So those are certainly things that are important to focus in on as you're writing the IEP. So for example, Noelle, my daughter, one of the statements that we had included in her IEP at one point in time was that it's important to ensure that she's attending to instructions, either by getting her attention prior to giving directions or asking afterwards if she understands what is expected. So just think about, how does your child engage with the classroom, or even with you, and what might they need to have in place to be able to really access that classroom learning environment. Social development is really a biggie, because I know that in some respects, some of our biggest concerns are about our kids' social interactions. And when they're younger, are they playing with other kids, and do they get just how they interact with others, reading social cues, things of that nature. But there's also aspects of their personalities that could really impact their classroom performance as well. So when you think about their ability to cope with frustration, if you hit something academically that's tough, are you going to be able to push forward, or is that possibly going to result in a behavior? Emotional regulation. Are you a kid that's just going to sit back and be really quiet, and even if you get frustrated, it's okay? Or if you're frustrated, does that result in a blow up or leaving the classroom, or how do you deal with that? Food anxiety is a huge one, and I really make sure that I emphasize that when I'm having conversations with the school. So for example, the way I've described it is I said that, a component of food anxiety for Prader-Willi is, the food issue for Prader-Willi is anxiety. Having food available or visible or being uncertain as to when food might be available can be extremely stressful for Noelle. When she's in an environment where she knows what she'll eat, when she'll be able to eat it, and that all food is out of her reach, she's typically focused and behaved. However, if there's food available to her, she believes that she can get something, she will attempt to do so. She's gone to extreme lengths to obtain food, such as going in the garbage or another student's backpacks. If in situations where she's unsure of what she will eat or when she might be put in a situation where food might be available to her, she becomes unfocused on school and only focused on the food. For example, asking repeatedly if it's time to eat, when it will be time, what she will have. So obviously you could see where her attention is completely drawn by the food, and therefore she's not able to really function or focus on the academics. Perseverative behaviors, are they the sort of kids that ask 5,000,001 questions and it's the same one every time? Rigidity, do they need routine? Do they struggle with transitions? There again, that need for structure, routine, and consistency. So, and as you go into middle school, that often, because you usually make a transition from a setting where they have one teacher all day long into a setting where they have multiple different teachers throughout the day who are going to handle things differently, have some different expectations. You're more likely to have a sub and not have somebody think to relay that to your student. Being able to really communicate about what may or may not frustrate your child or keep them from being able to focus on academics is really important. So, and I really should say that too, as I go through all these things, I can give you examples that are related to Noelle, but what's really important is your individual child, and every one of our kids is different. So you're going to know what's more likely to be a stressor versus what isn't, and how behaviors may show up. And so it's really important to share that with the school as you're going through this. Then obviously when you start talking about physical development, there's certainly a lot of different factors. I mean, motor skills and motor planning. You don't tend to see as much concern about, walking and navigating the building at this age, but you start thinking about things like, do they have the trunk strength to sit up at their desk? Do they have the fine motor skills to type and to write? Signs of illness. So what does your child look like when they're getting ill? Daytime sleepiness. Are you struggling with, narcolepsy or just that fatigue during the day where they might need a break or a nap? Scoliosis is certainly a variable that can impact their ability to, number one, sit at their desk throughout the day, but also to participate in activities like gym. Thick saliva, that drinking, so, do they need to keep drinking water throughout their day? The hyperphagia that we talked about earlier, and that food seeking, sensory processing. Do they need fidgets? Do they need the lights set differently? Do they respond strongly to noise? Do they need more activity? That high pain threshold, if something happens, how do you let them know that they're not feeling well? Temperature regulation, skin picking, all those different things that, we all live with on a daily basis, look unusual, and they might stand out a little bit, and it's best to really prepare the school about what to expect. I had things in Noelle's IEP about the fact that, she had issues with skin picking. I apologize, I tapped it forward when I leaned on something. But I said that, she might pick at her nails or bug bites. She'll usually respond well to prompts to stop, but might need something to keep her hands busy. We had built in that she doesn't run fevers and she rarely vomits, because obviously most children with PWS have no gag reflex. So if her behavior, we would just put it in quotes, seems off, you notice an increase in her food seeking, or she blanches suddenly, those are your best signs that she's not feeling well. So rather than looking for specific symptoms that you would look for in most kids, what does it look like when she's ill? And in some ways, this really stands out now with COVID, because a lot of the things that you would typically look for in terms of illness, that fever, the upset stomach, those sorts of things are not going to necessarily manifest the same way in a kid with Prader-Willi. So it's important to really outline, what your child's needs look like, so that if they're not feeling well, somebody can step in and look at how it's impacting them in the classroom or get a hold of you. So then we start talking about management. And here's where it becomes, even more complex as you're moving on to the middle school, because you start thinking about things like supervision. So in elementary school, most kids don't go much of anywhere without an adult. The class travels as a group, somebody walks with them in the hallways. Their opportunities to access things are really usually pretty restricted. However, when you start looking at middle school, you start looking at, hallways passing between classes. If they need to use the bathroom, there's usually not a bathroom in the classroom anymore. They're going out in the hallway to access the bathroom independently. Locker rooms, changing for, PE. There's usually not an adult in there for safety reasons. Other unstructured settings, so lunch, getting on and off the bus. There's a lot of opportunities where, certainly our individuals with Prader-Willi could find multiple opportunities to access different things. So you need to think about, what does that supervision look like? And one of the things that we've really talked about in terms of Noelle is that we've talked with people about the fact that even if there's an exposure that maybe to food that doesn't necessarily seem like it's a big deal in the moment, it's almost like she needs a recovery time. She might do something in the moment that might not be positive, and then she's going to be so focused on what happened previously that that's where her mind is going to be, other than on her classwork. Consistency between adults and including communication with substitutes. I think we can all agree that our kids are pros at knowing when there's a difference between the different adults working with them, and they will certainly take advantage of any inconsistencies. So it's important to really have a solid plan that every adult can adhere to. And then also think about what goes into sub-plans to make sure that individuals are prepared. And that could be something really simple that goes into a sub-plan that basically says, there's a student with some, some specialized dietary needs that could cause some behavioral problems. And then you could point out who the individual is that they could ask questions to ensure that those things aren't a problem. Use of food and instruction. When you're younger, you're usually talking about rewards or using manipulatives in terms of the class that gives out M&Ms for, a right answer or things like that. As you get older, you start talking about activities or labs. So you might have a lab where they're, a perfect example is the other day they were talking about doing can you follow directions? And the whole example revolved around making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. And they had the peanut butter and the bread there to see if the kids could follow directions. Labs, when you start talking about different types of sugars or, looking at just different consistencies. Like we had one where they were talking about cells and there was Jell-O. So really making sure that people are thinking ahead of time, because the reality is that really most activities and labs can be modified. They can find an alternate way to present the information that doesn't involve using food. But it's a matter of really having people think about that in advance. Peer access to food. What you start finding as you get a little bit older is that there's not clearly defined rules around food, because kids might not, they might be taking so many classes that they're not getting a lunch, and so they're eating their lunch in a classroom. Teachers are aware that they're getting up late before they come to school, so they might bring their breakfast in with them. The reality is, when you want to start talking about making sure that there's not any food exposure in the classroom, that extends to peers as well. And so it's really best to have a conversation with teachers in advance. One of the things that I had said when we've done a presentation is I said, look, I get that it's tough, but you're probably going to want to set that as your rule in the classroom from the get-go, because number one, if Noelle sees you have people in the classroom the first day they have food, she's going to remember that happened, and she'll always be wondering if it happens. But then if you take it away, the other peers are essentially going to revolt because they're going to say, why did you let us do that the first time? So it's really best to set yourself up from day one with that rule in your classroom, find alternate locations for them to eat, just to kind of maintain your structure and your routine in your classroom all along. Special events, will there be food? You're out of the realm of, birthday parties typically in the classroom, but then you start talking about some of those incentive systems, for not getting discipline referrals or good attendance. So if there's going to be a special event or they're earning a pizza party or something like that, what's that going to look like? Should they be communicating with you? Should there be a plan to have an alternate activity for your child with Prader-Willi? Just, how are you going to want to handle that? So, yeah, and I should say the bus too can be a real big one. That's something that we struggled with greatly. So we, one of the things that we had built into her IEP was that she needed to have her syndrome explained to all adults working with her, including transportation. So that was really important. So, and then communication with home, what would you want that to look like? The reality is you're probably not going to get every teacher to email you every day. But, what would you do to say, if something happens, how do they reach out? What should that look like? Do you want to have quarterly meetings to make sure that you're talking about needs or how things are going? Do you just want to know, do you want to email, things of that nature? One of the things that you're going to start to talk about as you're going into middle school is transition planning. So what happens is down the road, and the federal government says that it has to be in place by the first time that an IEP is going to be in effect for a student who's going to be 16 during that school year. So obviously that might seem a little bit down the road for students in middle school, but the reality is that there's a lot of age-appropriate transition planning that can start taking place when they're in middle school. Some states will actually start encouraging to start looking at like interest inventories or learning style profiles, things of that nature, even when they're in elementary. I know that here in New York, they have what they used to call the age 12 assessment. So right in that middle school range, and it might be, little questionnaires about how do I learn best? What helps me the most? What am I interested in? What do I think that I want to do down the road? The reality is, kids this age can give you some pretty wild and crazy ideas of things that they want to do. That is not relegated simply to our kids with Prader-Willi. So the conversation that the adults, both at school and at home, need to start engaging in is looking at, what is life after high school going to look like, and how do we expect to get there? So it might be post-secondary education. It might be some sort of vocational education. It might be integrated or supported employment. It might be what's their community participation going to look like. And it should really revolve around the student's strengths, interests, and preferences. So like, for example, when Noelle started out with this process, she would talk a lot about the fact that, she wanted to be a vet. She loves animals, and that was just something she really wanted to do. So we had some discussions about, okay, so what things would you need to be able to do to be a vet? And we talked a lot about, the math that might be involved and the reading that might be involved. And, do we think that that's, an expectation that we're going to get there, or is there something related that might be a little bit more up your alley? So what Noelle was like, she's like, I don't know that maybe a vet is going to be something that I'd be able to do on my own, but I bet you I could be a vet tech. And so she really got talking about that. So we had been looking at, what are the sort of things that we can have in place as we go forward. And right now she's actually doing, as a senior in high school, she's doing career and technical education in a nursing program, a nursing assistant program, because it was the closest parallel to that sort of area of interest to her. So the goals, the things that we started looking at, we started that planning when she was in middle school and kind of coming up with a plan. The reality is it evolves. Sometimes what kids say that they want to do in middle school isn't necessarily how you keep moving forward, but a lot of times you could build in skills such as, how do you use a time card? How do you schedule an appointment? Things of that nature. For some of our kids who aren't going to be able to function that in that capacity, it might be talking about how do you access the community? How do you advocate for what you need when you're struggling? The one thing that I think is really important to consider here is that question that I posed a while ago about, do you feel that your child's going to be independent? And so in Noelle's case, we had really talked about the fact that no, she anticipates that she's probably going to either be living with us or living in some sort of supported living environment. So skills like being able to plan a menu and cook for herself and grocery shop were not things that were important because we weren't anticipating that she was going to be doing those in the long run. It was more about the skills that she could master within the structures and supports that she was probably going to need. And I think that it's really important to start looking at knowing your state-specific exit options. So diplomas, credentials, certificates. It's not a bad idea to ask at this age about what does your state have available and how are you going to be able to work towards some of those things. Every state is a little bit different. There's different options, so it's important to really have those conversations with the staff working with your child. Being proactive about possible discipline issues. A lot of times you start hearing conversations about, suspensions and changes in placement and things of that nature. And I think that it's really important to start thinking about making sure that you've laid a good framework for addressing anything that might potentially be an issue. So one of the things that's floating out there is that it's a misnomer that a student with a disability cannot be suspended. A student with a disability can be suspended for violating the code of conduct, just like any non-disabled student would be. However, they shouldn't be suspended more frequently because of their disability. So that's one of those things to bear in mind. Now, if you've got a pattern of removals going, and I should really make sure that I preface that with any time that the school is calling and asking for a child to be picked up and they're going to be missing more than half a school day, or they're going to be in an in-school suspension room where it's more than half a school day, that really should be, you should be notified, and you should be notified in writing. It shouldn't just be like a gentleman's agreement. That's a removal. Because what happens is if you've got a pattern of removal, so either a suspension or a removal of 10 days that are just 10 consecutive days, or a pattern of removals that total 10 days. So like, say, for example, your child has a tendency to steal food from other kids in the cafeteria, and they're getting suspended for stealing. And that's happened 10 different times over the course of the year. It might be spaced out, but you've got like the same behavior that totals suspensions up to 10 days. They have to hold what's called a manifestation determination. And when you get into that manifestation review, what they're going to talk about is, was the behavior resulting in the suspension caused by, or did it have a direct and substantial relationship to their area of disability? Or they're going to ask about, did the school fail to follow a portion of the IEP, including a behavior intervention plan, which caused the misconduct? So my question is, go back and look at your child's IEP. When you look at all those different things that you've written into their present levels, whether it be, the food anxiety, supervision revolving around where they're going to be in unstructured settings? Are they looking at not having food in the environment? If they're frustrated, what's the plan? There is a section right after the present levels that's called special factors, and I kind of glossed over it earlier, but it asks the question about, do they need very specific positive behavioral interventions? You can say yes without needing a behavior intervention plan. But for kids who really need a very clear and specific behavior intervention plan, they should have what's called a functional behavioral assessment. that looks at what is the behavior of concern, when is it happening, and what seems to be triggering it. So it's looking about patterns. So it's not just about placing the blame on the child. It's about looking at why really behavior is communication. So where is this coming from? Why is the student behaving this way? And, what should we do to, kind of structure the environment so it doesn't happen? And how are we going to respond when it does? Now, if you've gone through and you've looked at your child's area of identification, and something I didn't mention earlier, but I feel really strongly about, I think when we look at the areas of identification available to our kids, it's important to make sure that Prader-Willi is at the forefront of the discussion, because it really can impact everything else. So for example, my daughter was receiving speech at one point in time. She definitely has a learning disability, but those things don't really encompass, the things she struggles with. There's an area of identification that's called other health impaired. And so my goal in sticking with that other health impaired was to say she has a diagnosis with Prader-Willi. It's pervasive, it's going to impact her in every area of functioning. And so that's where I wanted the emphasis of her IEP to be, is on all of her needs related to that. If you've laid out in the present levels information about behavior, about food anxiety, about social functioning, emotional issues, those things are all going to be there to really build a basis for if you come to a situation where your child's been suspended numerous times. You can say, look, there's information throughout this IEP outlining all these different things related to the Prader-Willi. They, clearly you're not meeting their needs as a student with Prader-Willi syndrome if you have to continually suspend them. Because the reality is, if they've suspended a student, they're acknowledging that they didn't have a better solution or a better intervention. So you can really raise the question of what's not being done, what's not being done properly. Should it be a different setting? Because clearly the one that they're in is still resulting in suspensions. So really, like I said, it's about making sure that, number one, your child's needs are being met from an academic standpoint throughout the IEP, but also you can build that basis for any discussions about behavior down the road. Practical advocacy, I think, is really important, because you can talk about all these routines and things that you want to say or what's the perfect things to do, but when you come to a meeting, you really need to be prepared to have conversations. And one of the things that I often say is, what's your gold standard and what's your acceptable fallback? So for example, you could know exactly what you want your child to have, and you might realize that that might be stretching it. It might be a little bit more than might possibly happen, but you're going to go in and try and ask for it no matter what. But I encourage you to have in the back of your mind, what can you be okay with? So that if you're not able to get exactly what you think your child needs, where's the place that you can be comfortable saying, you know what, this is a good starting place and we can keep moving forward. And probably a good example is when my child was starting, out in school, I really felt strongly that she needed a one-to-one, and I was prepared to argue that. But in the back of my mind, I had accepted, you know what, if they won't give her a one-to-one throughout the day, I can be okay as long as that person is there in lunch and anytime she's outside of the classroom where she might be unsupervised. So I went in, I built my case, but in the back of my mind, I was like, even if this doesn't happen, I can be okay knowing that she will be safe with that adult support in certain situations. But if you have to do that, or you have to go to your fallback and you don't necessarily get exactly what you're asking for in the moment, ask questions that, really say, what data can we collect to help build that case, and to come back to this question that I don't feel has been answered right now. And when is the plan to come back? So really, when can we follow up to make an informed decision? So an example might be, there was a student that he was younger, but he needed naps throughout his day. And the school said that they weren't going to build in break periods. They were just really resistant to that. And I said, okay, so let's start out with talking about how often is he napping, how much class time is he missing when he's napping, Or if he's falling asleep in class and then he wakes up and he's disoriented, how much class time is he not really accessing the information? Is he just not available? And then let's say we're going to come back in a month and talk about how much missed class time there is so that we can talk about how do we move forward. So knowing, you know, really just having a plan and then when you're going to come back to talk about it rather than just leaving it open-ended. I'm really a proponent of documenting everything. So put it in writing, and it might be as simple as, you know, you've had a conversation with the chairperson and you feel like you've come to a good place, but if there's kind of a gentleman's agreement in place, you know, what's to say that the next time you get back together and have a discussion that that's not going to be how people remember it. I would encourage you to follow up with an email saying, hey, thank you so much for talking with me today. I appreciate the fact that we're going to do blah, 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 and I appreciate the fact that this is when we're coming back to talk about it. So basically reiterate the things you just talked about it, and phrase it in a way that sounds positive and upbeat and appreciative, but yet makes it very clear that you've got it all documented and you can come back to look at that at a later date and time. And then have you fostered communication in advance of a potential crisis situation? And the reason I put this in here is one of the biggest things that we built into the training that we would do every year for my daughter is the reality is she was eventually going to play somebody. There was going to be a problem. Somebody was going to forget and leave food out. And I really wanted them to know that it was much better to come to me and let me know so that we could problem solve and move on quickly. Versus feel like I was going to just be all over them and it was going to become contentious. So I had shared that information, and I should, and I phrased that in a way that I said that when we did this training, one of the things that we built into our IEP, and I would encourage all families to do, is there is a section of the IEP that's called supports for school personnel. And it's a support that's not there for your child specifically, it's there for the staff that are going to need to work with them. And so we built in training. So whether that might be that they need to watch a webinar that's been provided by National, or you're going to do a presentation, or they might hire an expert to come in and present. It's really important to make sure that there's some sort of training related to Prader-Willi built in there to make sure that they're prepared and they've talked about things in advance. So like I said, going back to that, one of the things that I did when I did that presentation is I actually had a picture of a time that Noelle had actually stolen some food and then we had found it. And I basically, as I showed it, I said to them, look, I've been doing this for, at that point, 15 years. I said, she plays me on occasion. She will probably play you at some occasion. If you just let me know so that we can figure out how to move forward, she will trust that we're all on the same page. She will be much more responsive to you versus thinking that she might be able to play you again later. And we're all going to be able to work together better. So that being said, I ran through a lot of information very quickly. And I would encourage you to remember that this is a journey. Now I look at my child's IEPs going back over the years. There are things that I've tweaked over the years. There are some things when I describe her personality or food anxiety that have remained the same over the years. But there's always problem solving. There's always opportunities to change things. You can always come back to your committee and have conversations. So if your IEP is missing something, if you feel like you didn't get it exactly perfect the first time, we're in this for the long haul. And a lot of our kids are going to be in high school until they're 21 before they transition out. So it doesn't necessarily have to be perfect from the get-go, but you're always going to keep moving forward.
And with that, we will now have time for questions. Thank you, Amy. You can use the comment or chat feature to type out your questions, and we will answer them in the order we receive them. Amy, while everybody's typing out their questions, I know one of the most common ones is if you have examples from Noelle's IEP that you can share with others.
Absolutely. Oh, sorry. So absolutely, I actually have like the guiding questions that I refer back to, and then some sample examples I'd be more than happy to share out.
Great, thank you. We have a question. Would you suggest parents ask teachers for the curriculum before the start of the school year to review the lesson plans and see what there might be, such as your Jello example?
That might get really tricky if you ask for the curriculum as a whole. But if you give examples like that where you say, hey, there might be things like this that come up, and I would really love it if you could come to me, a week or two before some of those things come up so that we could possibly problem solve. You might get a little bit better of a response. I would love to think that people could get you stuff in advance. But even from personal experience, I found that I'm much better off going with that, give me a heads up unit by unit. It tends to run a little bit smoother.
Thank you. And then another question, would it be helpful to talk to other parents and students in the class so that way they understand PWS and know some of the food-related securities that they may want to take to help their friend or classmate with PWS?
Yeah, and I think that's a really important thing to work through. I know that we actually, and this is something, you could start now if you haven't already been doing it, but one of the things that Noelle had done when we were younger, we had the teacher kind of talk with the whole class about how to support her. And then as she got a little bit older, Noelle started asking for opportunities to do it herself. And she did a really good job of identifying the things that probably would stand out. So when she was a little bit younger, it was, you might notice that I leave the classroom when there's a birthday party. It's because I have, Prader-Willi. It makes me really anxious. It's really hard for me because I can't have what everybody else is having. And she was able to, start laying it out in, kid-sensitive terms, in terms of what's a big deal to a kid. And what we started finding is that a lot of her peers would actually, they would think ahead and they would look at stuff like that. So there was one year at Valentine's Day that one of the moms called me and asked if it was okay for her child to get Noelle some stickers and a book from the dollar store, because that way they didn't have to give her candy. So I think finding a very specific way, and it's, certainly how much you share with the parents, that can be a little bit tricky just because as you get into middle school, you're looking at a lot of parents. So I think that having a way to present to the individual classrooms and kind of tapping into what's the most pressing issue for your child, and what stresses them out the most is really good. But I think that kids tend to respond more to if they understand and they know, and somebody can phrase it in a way that makes a difference to them. So some of the examples that we used to give too were like, think about the time you've been the hungriest. How hard was it to focus when you were hungry? Like, did it start to hurt? Now, can you imagine feeling like that all the time? So kind of putting it on their level. But I do think it is important to talk with kids about some of that. But I think that there's also a teacher responsibility in terms of they just have to set some very clear limits in their classroom too. So it becomes a joint effort.
Thank you, Amy. It doesn't look like we have any more questions, so thank you for a very informative presentation tonight. If you do have any further questions for our presenter today, please submit them to info@pwsausa.org. You can also keep the conversation going by joining one of our many Facebook support groups. Just send us an email to info@pwsausa.org. This webinar will be available on our YouTube channel for those who want to listen to the presentation again. Thank you, everyone. Thank you again, Amy, for your presentation, and have a good evening.
You too.